Starting. Hi, Brian. Nice to have you on my start of the show. You know, just I'm glad to have you on this show. I've been following for a long time when you were writing under the pen name of Tony Catalucci. So, can you tell us about your journey in Thailand? I mean, how did you come up with this activity of writing articles and doing videos?
So, you know, I always tell people I started out as a U.S. Marine when I was 17 years old, and I was just out of high school, and I was very patriotic minded. But as soon as I joined, I was disillusioned. I started to see what this was all really about. And even though I was never in combat, I never went off to any of the wars the U.S. was fighting at the time, because I joined in 2000. And then there was 9/11, and then the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. But I never went to Afghanistan. But I was in Japan. I traveled from Okinawa to the mainland of Japan, also to the Philippines, and also to Thailand during training. And just the way the military, the U.S. military, was treating U.S. allies was bad, and it disillusioned me. And of course, at that time, they started preparing for the Iraq War, and even people around me in the military could see through that, and that there was really no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. This was something the U.S. would go and do, and so everyone was just going to go along with it. And I had senior officers, people that were in charge in the regiment that I belonged to, even they were saying, you know, I understand why you want to get out. I can't, because I've spent my whole life, and then it's my retirement. My whole life depends on it. They would say things like that to me in private. So I felt like I was making the right decision by getting out, and I decided to go to Thailand, one of the places that I had gone for training. I loved the country when I was here for training, getting to know the people and the culture, and I have been here since then. And I've never regretted it. I'm very happy to be here. And then of course I started writing about politics, because what was being said about even the war in Iraq, even though everyone knew they were being lied to, the fact that you would turn the TV on or go to any website and just be constantly lied to about what was going on there, it was frustrating that nobody was speaking up about it. So I just thought I would just start writing. And I was doing a lot of my own research just to understand what was happening. And I felt like, why not put this on a blog and share it with anyone who might be interested? And then come the Arab Spring in 2011, because I started covering US interference here in Thailand. I was looking at the color revolution mechanisms that were at play here. And when the Arab Spring began unfolding, I knew immediately what that was all about. And so I used my knowledge from seeing it firsthand here in Thailand. I used my knowledge to try to raise awareness of this, and now in hindsight, everyone says clearly, oh, that was U.S. engineered, obviously. But at the time, it wasn't so obvious, and a lot of people who agree with me on this now had completely different opinions on it, a different take on it at the time. And so now, about Myanmar and all of these things happening now today, we still have people coming out and trying to say, no, I think this time it's for real. And it's not. Just follow the money. It's so simple. So yeah, this is what I've been writing about for over 10 years now, following the money and showing people what these are really about. Not popular revolutions. This is organized regime change driven by the US government.
I'm very curious. Did you have a specific moment, a trigger that actually made you change your mind? You say, okay, I'm not from Thailand. I'm a foreigner. I mean, why should I speak up and so on? And did you have a specific trigger that moment you say, well, you know what, I need to speak out. Not this is the time, that's my responsibility. And what was, did you have any challenge? Because you're a foreigner. How did you feel you speaking out when you are a guest in Thailand?
It was in 2010, actually. So in 2009, there were these red shirt protesters in the street, and they were rioting in the streets. They were burning things down. They killed 2 shopkeepers while looting, but it passed very quickly. The military was able to regain control. They regained control without killing anybody. It was the next year in 2010 when they tried it again. And I watched the Western media go out to cover these protests. And this time, the protest organizers, these US-backed opposition groups, brought in armed militants, about 300 armed militants with war weapons, AK-47s, grenade launchers, M16s, hand grenades, and they've started killing people. And I watched the Western media in the streets, watching these war weapons, watching these militants, and then going back to their offices and writing articles about how the military is cracking down on mostly peaceful protesters. They use the word mainly peaceful or mostly mostly unarmed. And this drove me crazy. This is why I had to start writing. And I picked a pen name because I was a foreigner in another country. It's not my country. These people have no obligation to protect me. So I picked a pen name and I started writing about this and trying to expose it. This was in 2010. And then the next year was the Arab Spring, which was the exact same thing. We had the mystery gunmen here in Bangkok killing protesters and police and soldiers all at the same time to escalate everything, to attract international pressure, meaning Western pressure. So that was the trigger, the 2010 violence here in Bangkok.
Yes, there's an institution called the Monarchy, and it's very specific to Thailand. And I think foreigners, especially Westerners, they have a view on the monarchy in general to be something that is oppressive, which is not very undemocratic. So basically you have 2 sides. You have the pro-monarchy, and then you have the opposition, which is backed by the USA. Could you tell us a bit more about what is the function of the monarchy in Thailand?
Well, that's actually a really good point. And this is one of the most difficult things about covering Thailand. People will accuse me of being a monarchist. And a monarchist is someone who prefers the form of government run by monarchies. And that's definitely not my case. I admire the Thai monarchy, only the Thai monarchy, because it is an institution that has fought against Western imperialism for centuries. It unifies Thai people. It prevents foreign interests from coming into the country and dividing people, which is a prerequisite to destroying and conquering a nation. And even in modern days, we've seen this. We're seeing this in Myanmar right now. So that's one aspect of the monarchy that I admire. Another aspect is I think it is childish political perception to just look at something and say it's a monarchy, so I'm against it. What does the monarchy do? What does the monarchy here in Thailand do? The current monarchy, the current King Rama X, his father spent decades developing rural Thailand, going out, encouraging the government to build up infrastructure to support rural communities, but also encouraging rural communities to work together to create cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives. These are very leftist concepts that the Thai monarchy was promoting. This idea of self-sufficiency, of owning your own land instead of being beholden to landowners, paying rent to live on somebody else's land. This is something the Thai monarchy was promoting. And even today, King Rama IX's son, King Rama X, he promotes this even to this day. We have Siam Bioscience. This is a pharmaceutical concern here in Thailand. And the whole point of this is to break dependency on Western pharmaceutical corporations. And one of the institutes that they work with is out of Cuba. So you have this is the Crown Property Bureau, controls Siam Bioscience, and they are working with Cuba, who is renowned for not only working for their own people, but using their expertise in healthcare to help people all around the world. So this is the kind of thing that the Thai monarchy is involved in. This is atypical for what you would expect as a Westerner, familiar with Western monarchies. This is atypical behavior, but this is what the Thai monarchy does. So people should try to add some depth to their understanding, look past the isms, and look at what the institution is actually doing for people. It made a big impression on my life because before I came here, I just had my military training, which you cannot get a job doing that in the civilian world. It was the Thai monarchy and his the king's philosophy of self-sufficiency that got me interested in things like industrial design and doing tangible projects to help people in the community. This is what got me started in my profession as an industrial designer, because I'm actually not a journalist or a geopolitical analyst. I mean, it's something that I do, but my chosen profession is industrial design, and that this was inspired by the work of Thailand's king.
Could you give us a little bit of background when you had the red shirt and Thaksin coming over? What is the background of Thaksin and this movement, which was they call themselves socialist? I mean, are they really socialists? Because you just mentioned before actions, you know, by the monarchy, which were quite socialist. Then you have this group, self-proclaiming socialists. Can you give us the background and also what is where does Thaksin come from and what was his purpose? What did he want to do?
Okay, that's again, that's a really good question, because a lot of people will see the red shirts and all of the communist and socialist symbology, but then they will totally miss that this is a movement that was created by a Wall Street-backed billionaire, because Thaksin's background before he became prime minister, he was doing things like serving as advisor for the Carlyle Group. And then while he was prime minister, he did things like try to push through a free trade agreement with the US without parliamentary approval. That was one of the big things that got him in trouble. He committed Thai troops to the US invasion of Iraq, which was also very unpopular here in Thailand, but he did it anyway. And he used the country to host the CIA's rendition program. Well, one of the sites were here under his administration. So he did things like this while he was in power. And then when he was ousted in 2006 by a military coup, because he was creating basically a single party dictatorship, this was what he was doing. And he was doing it with Western backing. When he got ousted from power, he had many powerful Washington lobbyists, including James Baker's Baker-Bott lobbying firm. James Baker was also part of Carlyle and the Bush administration. This is what he did after he was ousted from power. He was still completely connected to Washington and Wall Street. He is the typical proxy that they would use to set up a client regime in a country like Thailand. And so the notion that the red shirts, because they're wearing red, or that they have communist or socialist slogans, that somehow that means that's very superficial. Scratched just under the surface, it is a street front created by a political machine run by a billionaire and backed by Wall Street in Washington. That is what it is.
So what was his purpose, Thaksin? I mean, sometimes they put people like him at the head to sell state-owned assets, the jewels of a country, or what was his purpose? I mean, and the backing of the US. Why use Thaksin? Why would the US meddle in Thailand? Especially Thailand has been historically more leaning towards the US. Why create trouble in a country which is already your ally?
It's Thailand being a close ally of the US, I think this is a leftover myth from the Cold War. Thailand was a reluctant ally of the US. If people remember, the US was killing millions of people in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The US with China actually at the time, which it's a very complicated history, but at the time it really appeared as if China and the US were working together to back groups like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And so Thailand is looking at the map, they're looking at the region. What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to also allow themselves to have their population killed by the millions? Or maybe make a concession, allow the US to base their military in Thailand? And then as soon as the war was over, as soon as Mao Zedong passed away, Thailand patched up its relationship with China and its neighbors, and the U.S. left. They left. They don't have a permanent military base here in Thailand, so that was really complicated. And then ever since, Thailand has been pivoting back toward east. As China has risen, Thailand's relationship has gone from leaning west for economic reasons toward leaning east. So at the moment, whether people realize this or not, this country right now, its biggest trade partner and investor is China. Biggest source of tourism comes from China. More tourists from China than all other Western countries combined. They're building the high-speed railway into Thailand, through Laos into Thailand. This is part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. So even at the time with Thaksin, the US knew China was rising. This was to head this relationship off before it reached critical mass, which it's reaching critical mass right about now.
Could you explain a little bit how is the US meddling? Is it like through the National Endowment for Democracy? If so, what is the strategy? I mean, how do they work? Can you throw in some information about the Gene Sharp? You know, like maybe some parallels. If you can draw some parallels with the Maidan Revolution and the whole process, how do you create a revolution?
It's basically one playbook. And you mentioned Gene Sharp. He actually literally had a playbook for color revolution. And you can see these protesters going from step one to, I forget how many it is, like 100 or some large number of tactics to use during a color revolution. And you could see the anti-government protesters here in the streets every day, ticking off one after the other, even ones that make no sense in Thailand's context. They even tried those, and it was ridiculous. And this protester Netawit was waving it around, actually waving Gene Sharp's book around and saying, we need to follow this. And he was one of the participants in the Oslo Freedom Forum. So it's one playbook where they cultivate the opposition years in advance. They infiltrate education. They infiltrate, legal circles, lawyers. They get into the media. And once they've infiltrated this and they start building up cadres of people who reflect Western interests, this is when they will pull the trigger on one of these protests, because they've got all of the supporting bases in place. So when they have these protests, it's not just people organizing and going out into the streets. You have the media backing them. You have lawyers who are going to get them out of jail or make a big problem for Thailand's government by going to the fake human rights organizations that the US funds all around the world. We had one here called iLaw that was trying to rewrite Thailand's constitution. And if you look at Ukraine in 2013, 2014, or you look back at the Arab Spring in 2011, it was all the same exact groups that were at the front, the public, in the public eye, these political groups. They were lawyers, they were student groups, they were media organizations, and if you dig into their funding and their activities, it's all through the National Endowment for Democracy. Some of them are just literally listed on the NED's website. So I have people, it doesn't matter if it's Thailand or Ukraine or Myanmar, they'll say, that's not true, the US isn't backing them. And then I show them. And then they say, well, the NED isn't part of the government. And then you explain how it was created by the government, funded by the government, overseen by the government. They just say it's a private organization because they're laundering the money through it. And then they backpedal to well, maybe the US just wants to support democracy in all of these places. And then you show them the board of directors and how it's war criminals like Elliot Abrams or Scott Carpenter, these people who have directly participated in crimes against humanity. And then they leave the debate because they have no answer and they don't want to admit that they were wrong. And it's the exact same process in every country. And then for people resisting it, it's the exact same headaches that you have to deal with, the same questions and denial from the same types of people, no matter which country it's in.
Yeah, I think there's a problem of people and misunderstanding that the priority for countries to preserve sovereignty above anything else. And I think this meddling should never be accepted. I'd like to go back to the last coup you had in Thailand. Could you give us the reason why the military took over? I think it was in 2014. Is it correct?
Yes. So at the same time, the Western media was promoting the protests in Ukraine. They were condemning the protests in Thailand. There were protests that led up to that coup here in Thailand. And this all goes back to Thaksin Shinawatra. He was ousted from power. He's a convicted criminal. He's a fugitive who lives overseas. And yet in the 2011 elections, general elections here in Thailand, his party ran basically openly as his proxy, and his sister was his placeholder. She wasn't a politician. She just had the last name Shinawatra, so she ran as candidate for prime minister. Their slogan for the 2011 election was "Thaksin thinks, Pheu Thai does," which Pheu Thai is the name of his political party. And so he was openly running for office as a fugitive hiding overseas. Could you imagine if Donald Trump was a convicted criminal, fled to Russia, and was still running for president, and had his son as his proxy? It would be unthinkable. But yet, this is what the Western media was supporting and claimed was a democratic landslide victory for when Thaksin's sister Yingluck Shinawatra got into power as prime minister in 2011. And then what she did was immediately start trying to change the laws to exonerate her brother, bring him back, and so that he could be prime minister again. It was ridiculous. It was something that if you did as satire, people would say that's ridiculous. You know, satire should be more subtle, but this was something they were really doing. And then on top of that, to buy votes, because they claim that they're very popular. They're not. And what they do is they buy votes. And to buy votes, they proposed this rice subsidy scheme, which was going to give way over market value prices per ton for rice. And what this did was distorted the markets, then crashed the markets. And then other countries that sell rice internationally had this huge advantage because the quality was dropping in Thailand because of corruption. Cronies in the government were importing rice from Cambodia and using inferior rice just to check it in. You know, like, here's a ton of rice, and then they would get their money. So the whole fund collapsed. There were farmers, 1 million farmers, who didn't get paid for over 6 months. Do you know anyone, let alone a farmer, who can wait 6 months to get paid for their work? You know, and this was what was going on. So even farmers who had voted for Yingluck Shinawatra and her party ended up in the capital joining the protests. And of course, just as in 2010, there were armed militants who came out, and this time they were attacking the protesters. Almost daily drive-by shootings, grenade attacks. They killed women and children, and then eventually the military intervened, not only to throw out Yingluck, who had no legitimacy even from the beginning, but also to stop the violence. So that's the background there.
So back then it was Thaksin and the Red Shirt movement, and recently there's a new movement which is led by Thanathorn. Could you give us the link? What is the link between the two of them, and why in 2019, during the last elections, they didn't ally and have a front against the pro-monarchy, the United Front?
Well, actually, they did. I mean, Thanathorn's party, Future Forward, at that time, it's now called Move Forward. Their political headquarters is literally the next building over from Thaksin Shinawatra's Thai political headquarters. They have joint press conferences in the room. They'll like go downstairs and go over into the other building and do joint press conferences. They immediately, after the election, created a coalition, an opposition coalition, and Pheu Thai, Thaksin's political party, literally nominated Thanathorn as their candidate for prime minister after the 2019 general election. So they were working together. What they were trying to do was spread out their party as much as possible. So they made multiple parties, but it was all ultimately run by Thaksin Shinawatra and his foreign backers. And they had all of these different parties pretending that they were trying to grab different parts of the electorate. But at the end of the day, they were all going to work together because they're all run by the same handful of people. So Tanaton is just a rebranding. These protests are just a rebranding of the red shirts. Some of the protests literally do just have red shirts that show up. We saw all the way back in, I think it was around 2011, between 2011 and 2014, you saw some of these characters around Tanaton bringing in red shirts and trying to, educate them about, this like very fake leftist dogma that they were going to try to dress them up as, so they didn't look like just street thugs, that they would look like a student movement. So this was just an exercise in rebranding. And they've tried as hard as possible to make it look like they're not connected, but obviously they are. It's very clear that they are.
So what is the geopolitical game of the US? What do they want to do? There is something, there's the Belt and Road Initiative, and we clearly see that these oppositions are against anything which is related to Belt and Road Initiative. So what is the political game of the US to back those opposition groups?
I think a perfect example to explain why is Tanaton himself. Before the 2019 election, he went to the United States to, I don't know, like it's an election in Thailand, but you're going to the US to campaign. Very bizarre. And one of his stops was at this Hyperloop, like this Hyperloop test track or something. I don't even know if it was finished yet or not at the time. And the Hyperloop is a great idea, but it's not a solution to anything. It hasn't moved any real passengers at all, and it won't for many years to come. And then when he returned from the US, he said that the Thai government signing a deal with China to build a high-speed rail was the wrong idea, that they should invest in Hyperloop instead, which is, again, it's childish. It's not something you would expect a grown adult, let alone someone who wants to be prime minister, to say, because, again, the Hyperloop it's a concept. It's not a real infrastructure project yet. It won't even be working in the US for years to come, if ever it comes. So what he was doing was condemning a actual real solution that moves billions of people in China every year, that is proven technology. He's trying to block that project, and the substitute is non-existent. So he's just blocking development. He's not actually proposing a real alternative. And this is what the US wants in every country surrounding China. Someone like Tanaton, who is going to block real development, make these promises, these fantastical promises that will trick kids, because that's his target audience. Kids, a lot of them aren't even old enough to vote, his support base. And that's what they're trying to do in Myanmar. That's what they're doing here in Thailand. They were trying to do that in Cambodia. That got uprooted pretty much completely. They were doing that in Hong Kong, as you know, and as you've pointed out. This preying on young people who don't get how things work, promise them these fantastical things that could never possibly happen, and adults know it can't happen. They have the experience. They know how hard it is to build anything. Building this Hyperloop in Thailand, ridiculous. But this is their strategy, to just surround Thailand or surround China with people like Tanaton from Thailand, or Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, these people who are good at making promises and blocking Chinese development.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Crack Canal, this canal that was would be used to bypass the Malacca Strait? What is the status, and why it didn't go through?
I've looked into this a lot recently. It's actually a very, very interesting, just as an engineering project. It's a very challenging engineering project because it would be going over very difficult terrain, and the sea levels are different on both sides. And if it were built, it would be huge, because it would allow ships to go from one side to the other much quicker than going around Singapore. Much quicker. It would save days. They've actually already built a highway between two proposed points. kind of make like an overland bridge. So you would unload the ship on one side and then bring stuff to the other side. But they never built the ports, or they haven't built the ports yet. So there's a range of engineering issues, political issues inside Thailand, and of course, geopolitical concerns that have gotten Thailand interested in this, blocked it or delayed it, and then ultimately blocked it. So this is it's something we should all keep an eye on. Always keep an eye on this, but it's not. I don't think that it's just because the U.S. is putting pressure on Thailand not to do it. I think there's a lot. It's a very challenging engineering project, just on its own.
You mentioned the civil unrest in Myanmar, and well, I've heard this Milk Tea Alliance. Could you give us a little bit more information about what is happening? Is it related to the pivot to Asia? And maybe actually could be interested to go back to the Pentagon paper. I mean, is that all related? The Pentagon paper, the pivot to Asia. Could you give us the background when this focus on Asia started?
The Pentagon, well, the focus on Asia started since the U.S. could reach Asia by warship and its trading vessels a long time ago. And I think you're probably familiar with the U.S.'s role in dividing up China alongside the British Empire. And then after the World Wars, the U.S. and Europe were interested in reasserting their control over Asia, their primacy over Asia. And the word primacy shows up in policy papers decades ago and also policy papers today. This is something the U.S. is obsessed with. The Pentagon papers were leaked, I think is like in the late 60s or 70s. And what they were all of these documents about U.S. policy regarding many things, but also the Vietnam War. And they were talking about how continuing the Vietnam War and bombing northern Vietnam, it would only make sense if it was contributing towards the overarching plan of the U.S., which is to encircle and contain China. And they mentioned that there are these different fronts that they're trying to encircle China through. And of course, East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, all of Southeast Asia, including their ongoing war in Vietnam, and also India and Pakistan. And we can see from then, decades later, this is something the U.S. is still doing. They're in Afghanistan right now, which shares a small section of border with China. And this is where all the extremists and weapons and everything are getting into Xinjiang through, one of the avenues. They're involved in Southeast Asia. So you asked about the Milk Tea Alliance. Their dream is to get all of the governments in Southeast Asia on board with encircling and containing China, but they will never do that because China is the driving engine of economic development in the region. All of these governments are more than happy to be partners with China. So if you can't get them to go along, build up an opposition in each country that could eventually either pressure them to be adversarial against China or to overthrow them and to take power and then to cut themselves off from China. So this is what the Milk Tea Alliance is all about. It's a regional US State Department project to create this opposition in each country, have them cooperating with each other, and to overthrow their respective governments and then to cut ties with China. This is the whole plan. And if you look at the Milk Tea Alliance, the only thing that they really have in common is they're backed by the US government and they all profess hatred of China, irrational hatred, all based on lies that the US has been telling for decades.
Yes, I think it's very interesting to see already back in 1972, you had Nixon meeting with Mao Zedong. But at the same time, Nixon was meeting with the Alptekin, this person that actually his son created the World Uyghur Congress, and at the same time was also financing the Dalai Lama. So it was all hypocrisy. I would like just to go back to maybe Myanmar, because it's a hot topic right now. I think probably Myanmar is heading towards civil war. And this personality, Aung San Suu Kyi, could you give us more information about what is her background? how she came into power, and what is the relationship between that she has with both with the US and China?
Aung San Suu Kyi, she was educated, at least partially in the UK. Then she was working in New York for the UN. She was married to a British professor who specialized, I think it was Tibet, something like that, or Himalayan studies. And her two children are British citizens. And she went back to Myanmar to get involved in politics and to lead all of these opposition groups. And from the moment she set foot there all the way up to and including today, she has been funded and backed by the US. And when I say that, I don't mean like they're just kind of helping her out a little bit. They created her entire political machine. The military of Myanmar is the one that controls most of the economic industries in Myanmar. Her support base, they are all getting funding from overseas, from USA, from the NED, from the British government, from all of these foreign interests. And again, like they're all very anti-Chinese. They're very pro-West. A lot of them have studied in the West, or they have studied in programs funded by the West here in the region. And the information minister, before he was ousted out of power during the military takeover in February, he was actually trained at some program here at the FCCT, the Foreign Correspondence Club of Thailand, which was funded by Open Society. And then he went over to Myanmar and became the Minister of Information. So Aung San Suu Kyi is like the ideal client regime of the West. From top to bottom, it was created by the West. And actually, you sent me the information about Sean. What is his name? Yes, and he's part of some Myanmar Development Institute, which gets funding from USAID, and he is Aung San Suu Kyi's financial advisor. He's just this white guy running around Myanmar advising a supposed leader of the government. So it couldn't be more like the Myanmar under the British Empire, unless you had just British viceroys running around. And it's sad. And when she was, that brief moment where she was in power, sure, she was doing business with China. If you look at Myanmar's economy, they do almost all of their business with China, and then number 2 is Thailand, and then number 3 is Singapore. So they don't actually have economic activity with the West. So in order to keep the country functioning, to keep people in jobs, she has to sign deals with China. She has to keep things going. I think eventually her plan was to incrementally start selling things off to the West and to bring the West in. That's one theory. Another theory is that the West didn't really care about Aung San Suu Kyi running a functioning country. I think maybe ultimately they wanted to just destroy the country, leave Aung San Suu Kyi with a smoldering pile of cinders, just to place this dead weight around the neck of China and the rest of Asia, because the US sees China as the biggest threat, but also Asia as a whole is rising and will bypass the US, will pursue their own interests on the world stage independently of the US. This is something the US has openly stated is unacceptable. They will not allow. So that could be another reason why.
Yes, there's a project, a dam project that was stopped a decade ago. Can you give us a bit, what did she do? I mean, what was she part of this blockade of this project? And who was, I heard about some NGOs, more like green NGOs. What was behind this?
There's the Nissan Dam, and this was proposed by China in cooperation with the Myanmar government, which at the time was run by the military. And it was Aung San Suu Kyi, it was her political party, it was her supporters, it were these monks. They're supposedly monks, but they're always out beating people with steel rods and chopping people up with machetes. And they would go out, they would attack construction sites, they would block roads. And you said NGOs, well, these are these fronts funded by the NED. You could go to the NED website right now and you can see these human rights, and environmental fronts. And that's what they do. They're blocking development, and they're using human rights and environmentalism as a pretext. What they're really doing is just blocking development. They claim, oh, if you block the river, if you build this dam, these people won't be able to fish. They're fishing things to extinction. They need development. They need to develop a modern economy. Stop fishing species to extinction and chopping down the forest. They need to build up a real economy. They need electricity. This is what the dam would have been a part of. And the US is funding these NGOs specifically to stop development. And something else development often does in a country is help unify it. Ever since Myanmar gained independence from the British Empire, they have been fractured and divided. The US and the British government specifically pour money into these ethnic groups, which include these fake environmental and human rights NGOs, specifically to keep those ethnic fault lines in place and to keep the animosity going, to keep the country divided. If you were building highways, railways, dams, infrastructure for people, building up economic prosperity, these people would end up putting those things aside, uniting as one country, and they would be able to work together for their collective interests. How does a tribe in Myanmar benefit from independence from the central government? How does that make Myanmar stronger or that tribe stronger when dealing with other countries, whether it's China or the US? Where is their leverage? So it's obvious, like divide and conquer. This is very basic. And this is what the US and the British have been doing. And before that, the British Empire was doing in Myanmar. And it's just a continuation. It's a modern update of these NGOs are modern updates of like what the missionaries used to do coming over from Western Europe.
The latest news tell us that they're starting to work together, those ethnic armed groups working with the opposition. So there's a clear sign that maybe a risk of balkanization of Myanmar, right?
Yes, well, it's just going to be an acceleration of what the US has been supporting all along. So these ethnic groups, a lot of times they're fighting with each other as well, and they're also fighting internally. So this is exactly what we saw in Libya, where the US stitched together this artificial coalition, was flooding the region with weapons and money and clandestine support. And once they overthrew the Libyan government, they just went right back to killing each other. Plus, now they have got all these new weapons to do it with. And then that chaos spread out across the entirety of North Africa, and then also into the Middle East. And so they're maneuvering everything into place to do the exact same thing in Southeast Asia. Right now in Myanmar, there's already people coming over the border into Thailand. This has happened in the past, but it's incredibly dangerous now because we see protesters screaming for R2P, responsibility to protect, for the UN, for the US to come and liberate them. And we all know what that means. And surely they know what it means. So you have to really ask yourself, like, why are they asking for that if they know it's going to turn Myanmar into another Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine? Why would they be asking? Why would they be asking for this? It's unbelievable. It's happened so many times in the last 2 decades, and there seems to be no collective memory of this amongst these so-called protesters, these opposition groups. It's very selfish what they're doing and destructive.
Just going back to the coup, the military, they call this a constitutional coup, and they are, according to the constitution, they're supposed to go back to new elections. Back then they said it was due to rigged elections, and Aung San Suu Kyi, she didn't want to do an audit of the elections. Could you give us a little bit the background why there was a coup? I mean, besides this, was there a problem of protecting sovereignty from the military?
Absolutely, because a flawed election is a huge understatement, and a rigged election, a huge understatement. And they're saying, where is the evidence that the election was rigged? Go to the National Endowment for Democracy's website, look up Myanmar under Burma, which they're still calling it Burma, the British imperial nomenclature. for Myanmar. And look at all of those programs the US government is funding, interfering in Myanmar's internal political affairs. Democracy is a process of self-determination. So if everything about the opposition in Myanmar is being determined in Washington, this is not democracy, this is foreign interference. Under those conditions, you cannot have a free and fair election, even if technically everything at the polls works exactly as it's supposed to. You have an opposition that is being run out of Washington, D.C. There can be no actual democratic, free, fair election representing the people in Myanmar if the party represents the interests of Washington, who is backing them, who is funding them, and supporting this huge network all around them, including media. They will be able to win elections every single time because they have this huge international machine behind them. Nobody else in Myanmar even stands a chance. So, of course, like I said, a flawed election, a rigged election, a huge understatement. The election has been hijacked by foreign interests. And it's interesting because the US has complained so much about this with no evidence at all regarding Russia. And they've made it out as if it was like another Pearl Harbor or 9/11. And yet they've done this to Myanmar, and they're condemning the military for trying to set things back on track. And just as you said, it's an issue of sovereignty. That election was a huge violation of Myanmar's sovereignty. And again, whatever people want to think about Aung San Suu Kyi, go look at the video of her hanging out in Washington, D.C. with the National Endowment for Democracy, accepting awards from National Endowment for Democracy, all of her supporters, her main supporters, going there and doing likewise over the years. It's not a party that represents Myanmar. It's a party that represents Washington in Myanmar.
Well, how can you explain the change in the relationship between Washington and Aung San Suu Kyi? Remember, she was named, she had the Nobel Prize. I mean, Nobel Prize, you know what it means. It means you are a pawn, and sometimes you are even a war criminal too, so you can get the Nobel Prize. So she, and they made movies about her, right? So she went from being the queen of the West to being someone, a controversial personality. What happened?
For decades, her followers have been extremely racist. They have brutalized the Rohingya minority in Myanmar. There are all Aung San Suu Kyi herself, when she became, state councilor, and people in her party and her supporters, heads of very influential opposition groups, all took turns making comments about how the Rohingya are Bengali invaders, stealing their land and their water. And they would have their followers go into these communities, chopping people up, burning their homes and businesses down. So just like what the US does with Saudi Arabia, they cover all of that up. And then if Saudi Arabia deviates even the slightest from US interests, all of that dirty laundry is aired. Everyone gets to see it. So I suspect that Aung San Suu Kyi was not cutting off ties from China fast enough for America's, what America expected. And so they started doing that to put pressure on her. I don't think it was because they wanted her out of power. Obviously they don't, because now they're trying to get her back into power. This was just like if you have a pet dog and he misbehaves, you don't throw him out of the house, but you might roll up a newspaper and maybe spank him a little bit just to set him back on course. I think this is what the US was doing with Aung San Suu Kyi. And again, like with the whole Rohingya crisis, it was very clear that the US was looking at that as an opportunity to maybe get involved internationally. They were playing both sides. They were trying to infiltrate the Rohingya groups. They had already long infiltrated the anti-Rohingya groups. They controlled all of the fake human rights groups involved on both sides. And so they were trying to use that as a vector to get involved, maybe militarily or through the UN, to get some sort of presence there in Myanmar, right on China's border. And when they couldn't, now they see this new crisis as an opportunity to do that with the whole R2P thing all over again.
So everything that is happening right now, I mean, we see like a Tibet independence movement, there's a Uyghur, there's a Myanmar, there's Thailand. So there's this strategy of an encirclement of China. where do you see this going? We still saw there's a last bill which is $300 million, which is going to be invested against the Belt and Road Initiative. Where do you see this going between the US and China?
That's interesting that you point out that, Bill, because people who checked out the Indo-Pacific framework published by the White House archives, this was from under the Trump administration, they were talking about how they need to communicate to the region how bad China is. And so now they have this bill. So it's just going to continue no matter who's president, doesn't matter. This is a singular agenda, like we were talking about with the Pentagon Papers, stretches back decades, actually even before the world wars. So what's going to continue happening is the US is going to continue this strategy. They're going to continue trying to destabilize countries. Regime change is very unlikely. Getting an opposition figure in like Aung San Suu Kyi and then building a viable state that serves Western interests without China's, without any link to China economically is impossible. So what they're going to do is just slash and burn everything all around China and just try to surround it by these fires and hope that eventually they could light fires inside China as well, like what they've been trying to do in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong and also Taiwan. So it's going to continue like this, and it's going to be up to China and also leaders here in ASEAN and East Asia of asking themselves what kind of future they want to live in. Do they want to live in a future where they refuse to stand up to what the US is doing and burn in these fires that are being lit? Or do they want to get together? And I'm not saying like some kind of alternative version of NATO, but at least cooperate with media and getting these fake NGOs out and replacing them with real NGOs that actually serve the communities they're based in, doing things like this to kind of counter this, to take the US's pieces off the board and to leave the US only one option dealing with Asia, and that's to deal with them on equal terms as partners. Everybody would benefit, just like what China's doing with everyone, just like what Russia's doing with everyone, and even Europe, Western Europe. I don't think they're quite there yet, but I think they're starting to see the merit of dealing with people on equal terms and stop treating them like former colonies. They still got a long way to go, but there's hope there, and for the US there's hope there too. But these interests driving this regime change campaign, encirclement, they're still very powerful. They're not going to change their minds. We have to wait for them to kind of fade, and then perhaps a new circle of interest in the US that have a more constructive worldview taking their place.
Would you agree with me that if I said that US has no friends but only hostages? Because you see, I mean, friends, they call them friends like Japan, like Italy, like Germany, but they have army bases there, and their politics is hijacked by the US. They cannot have freely a relationship with China. They need to be extremely careful how to deal. And whenever they step out of the track, they are being sanctioned. So would you agree with me that there are lots of hostages, not friends?
That's a good point, because just look at Germany, for example. I've covered this many times for a while, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is benefiting absolutely everybody involved. Russia, Western Europe, Germany, all of the companies involved in building it, all of the companies that will be involved in maintaining it, they all benefit from this. And they benefit from having cheap, plentiful energy coming into Western Europe from Russia. Everyone benefits from this. Plus, Russia has, if you think Russia is this evil empire festering on the, to the east, having this pipeline going into Western Europe gives them one more reason to be a little less evil and to work, because that's the truth, is that they just want to do business with Western Europe and make money just like everybody else. So what did the US do? They didn't just put sanctions on Russia, they're putting sanctions on German companies, other European companies involved in the pipeline. They're backing the Green Party in Germany, and the Green Party, by the way, is the same one behind the Henrik Bull Foundation, funding subversion around the world side by side with the NED. So they're backing them. So they're meddling in Germany's internal political affairs also, exactly what they accused Russia of doing in the US is doing in Germany. And they're doing it to block a project that benefits Western Europe and also Russia. And they're, you say hostage, well, they're holding them as hostage, but they're not even admitting that that's what they're doing. They're making excuses. They're trying to say Western Europe doesn't understand the security threat of this pipeline. So we have to intervene and protect them from themselves, from their own bad judgment. It's absurd, but it exposes that, just like you said, they don't have any friends. It's an empire. They want primacy over the entire planet, friend or foe. And anyone who steps out of line, they get the exact same treatment. Actually, we saw with India, them doing the freedom of navigation exercise off the shores of India without notifying them. It was a huge insult to India. And why? Because US seeks primacy over all of Asia, not just China, but everyone in Asia, including India, including Australia, including Japan.
Well, it was very. I'm very glad we had this conversation, Brian. I think it's very important to give all this information to educate people. The problem we have is the information game. You see Hollywood and all the mass media, the social media too. We don't get a voice because there's censorship. Could you just go back? Maybe I'd like to go back to you. Situation right now in terms of social media, you've been shut down, and how do you protect yourself? I also question I think sometimes I'm worried about your position. I mean, what you are saying, you are probably one of the very few, you're the only English speaker that is very vocal about Myanmar and Thailand. Don't you think it's dangerous for you? I mean, how do you manage this?
Well, like you said, I've been kicked off of Facebook and Twitter. I have one Facebook account, but I don't use it for anything, because as soon as I start using it, the US-backed opposition here will immediately report me, and Facebook will immediately delete it. So I try not to do anything political with that. Twitter, absolutely no way. I've had people make fan clubs to help support my work and spread it on Twitter and Facebook. They've been deleted. So you're not even allowed to talk about Brian Berletic on Facebook or Twitter, or you'll get deleted by Facebook and Twitter, which is a huge irony, because they're always talking about supporting free speech. And YouTube is the last US-based social media platform that I'm on, and I'm waiting for that, to eventually, disappear. I'm preparing for it, but also at the same time, every time they've tried to censor me, I've found ways to connect with more people and to get the message out further and further. I wrote under a pen name. I had to come out because the US Embassy was talking about my work and condemning it as disinformation. And Facebook and Twitter deleted my account, my pen name accounts, but also my personal accounts, all on the same day. So I knew they knew who I was. And so I had to come out. But since I've come out, I think I've reached a lot more people. It's thanks to people like you, Angelo, and all of the people that you've helped point my work towards, and they've picked it up. And I'm hoping that I'm not the only guy talking about this, about Myanmar and Thailand. I'm hoping to change that. I want more people to talk about it. I want them to take this information and use it any way they can, just to get it out there. Because a victory by Wall Street and Washington anywhere on Earth is a setback for anyone else on Earth that is facing the same threat. This is why I covered Syria for 10 years. I don't live in Syria. I've never been to Syria, but I saw what was happening to the people there, to the government there. And I felt, if I don't speak up about this now, when it's coming back to Thailand, nobody's going to speak up about it then. So it's a duty for all of us. When we see this happening, we need to get the word out. We need to break up those narratives that the Western media is telling, trying to make these basically just traitors and dupes into heroes, and using them to burn entire countries to the ground. And it's unfortunate, the ordinary people in the streets of Myanmar, they're totally brainwashed. They have no idea what they're doing, and they have no idea the cliff that they're being led off of. And again, we saw it in Libya and Syria, but they themselves still can't see it. They think it's going to be different. And if we could stop it from happening, those are real people. You know, they have families. They have dreams about the future. Maybe someday they'll wake up and they'll be your best ally. I don't want to see this happen to them.
It's amazing what you're doing, really, Brian. I really respect you for that. I think also they are desperate people. I saw this in Hong Kong. There were desperate people. You know what we call the silent majority. It's a majority that is not politicized, that is not interested in politics. And they need your voice. So you see those people in Thailand, I can imagine also in Myanmar, who is talking for the silent majority? No one, because they shut, you know, they shut them from social media. And I think your voice is very important. So I really appreciate, I'd like to thank you for what you do, for your job, really.
Yes, and also thank you, Angelo, for all of your support. And honestly, I cannot do this without people, you know, helping share my work and helping, because like what you have done with Hong Kong is like, it's another pillar, you know, a pillar in building a resistance. And then once you have all the pillars, you can start connecting everything together and really resisting against this. So thank you as well.
Just to end this interview, could you give more information about your platform, your Patreon? You know, how can you give us some more information about your YouTube channel too, please?
Okay, so my YouTube channel is Land Destroyer. If you just type in Land Destroyer, you'll see the black and white LD logo. And then if you go to any of those videos, in the video description, there will be the links if you're interested in supporting my work through Patreon or some other way. All of the links are in there. And I also have a blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com, where I post all of my articles. And I'm trying to get my videos up there. I do videos 5 times a week about everything all around the world. But I'm focused on Myanmar right now. But you could check out, just if you get to one of them, they're all connected to the other.
Excellent. Brian, it was very nice to talk to you. Well, keep it up, my friend. Huh?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.